The wind that howled down from the high peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains did not care that Eleanor Blackwell was tired. It did not care that her bones ached from 3 weeks of rattling inside a stagecoach. Nor did it care that the leather of her boots was too thin for the Montana hardpack. The wind simply bit, sharp and relentless, tearing at the hem of her gray traveling dress as she stood alone on the edge of the wagon trail. The driver of the freight wagon, a man with a beard like a wire brush and eyes that had seen too many harsh winters, tossed her heavy trunk into the dirt with a thud that echoed the finality of her decision. He climbed back onto his seat, wrapping the reins around his gloved hands, and looked down at her with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "You are sure this is the place?" "Ma'am," he asked, his voice shouting over the gusting gale. "There is nothing up that rises but old timber and wolf tracks, I am sure," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled inside her woolen muff. "My uncle's deed is clear." The driver spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the snow-dusted sagebrush. "Suit yourself. If you live till spring, come down to Bitter Creek for supplies. If you do not, well, the mountain keeps what it takes." With a crack of his whip, the wagon lurched forward. Eleanor watched it go, the wooden wheels grinding against the frozen earth until the vehicle disappeared around a bend of pine and rock. Silence rushed back in to fill the space the wagon had occupied. A silence so profound and heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She turned toward the incline. Up there, hidden within the dense embrace of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, was the legacy of Tobias Blackwell. It was all she had left. The climb took hours. By the time Eleanor wrestled her trunk to the clearing, dragging it inch by painful inch over roots and rocks, the sun was dipping below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and blood orange. She stopped, breath sawing in her throat, and looked at her inheritance. It was a ruin. The cabin slumped against the hillside as if it were tired. The front porch sagged dangerously to the left. The roof shingles were curled and moss-eaten, and the window shutters hung askew like broken eyelids. It looked less like a home and more like a carcass the wilderness was slowly digesting. Eleanor felt a sting of tears, hot and sudden, but she forced them back. Tears were for the girl she used to be, the girl who wore silk in Philadelphia parlors, who played the piano for guests, who believed her father was a titan of industry and her fiancé, Julian, was a man of honor. That girl had died the day the police battered down their mahogany door and dragged her father away in irons for embezzlement. She had died completely when Julian sent a letter, not even facing her in person, breaking their engagement to save his family's reputation. That Eleanor was gone. The woman standing in the snow had $34 in her reticule, a deed to a rotting cabin, and a determination forged in the fires of humiliation. She mounted the steps, testing each board before trusting it with her weight. The door was stuck, swollen with years of dampness. She had to throw her shoulder against it, grunting with unladylike exertion, until it gave way with a shriek of rusted iron. The air inside was stale and cold, smelling of mouse droppings and dead ash, but it was dry. She struck a match, the sulfur flaring briefly, and lit the kerosene lantern she had carried from the road. The light revealed a single room. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table sat in the center, and a narrow bed frame lay in the corner, stripped of bedding. "It will have to do," she whispered to the emptiness. "For the next 2 weeks." Eleanor waged war against the mountain. She scrubbed the floorboards with water carried from the freezing creek until her knuckles were raw and cracked. She stuffed mud and moss into the chinks between the logs to keep the wind at bay. She learned that survival was not a romantic notion, but a brutal, daily grind of calories burned versus calories gained. It was during the 3rd week that the feeling began. It started as a prickle on the back of her neck, a sensation of eyes boring into her as she chopped kindling near the tree line. She would spin around, axe in hand, her heart hammering against her ribs, but there was never anything there, just the swaying branches of the pines and the deep, impenetrable shadows of the forest. Then came the noises. At night, The wilderness came alive with screeches and howls that made her pull her thin blankets up to her chin. But one night, the sound was different. It was the heavy, rhythmic crunch of boots on snow. Eleanor sat bolt upright in the dark, clutching the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She listened, straining her ears until they rang. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. "Who is there?" she called out, her voice sounding thin and fragile. "I have a gun." She did not have a gun. She had a dull axe and a paring knife, but the lie was all she had to offer. There was no answer, no knock, just a long, stretching silence that lasted for an hour before the footsteps crunched away, fading into the trees. When she opened the door the next morning, pale and exhausted, she found her wood pile. She had left the logs in a haphazard heap the evening before, too tired to stack them properly. Now, they were piled in a neat, perfect pyramid against the cabin wall, sheltered from the coming snow by a sheet of old bark she had discarded days ago. She stared at the wood, her breath pluming in the frigid air. It was a kindness, but it terrified her more than any threat, a threat she could understand. This silent intrusion meant someone had been close enough to touch her home while she slept. She decided she needed answers, and she needed supplies. It was time to go to town. Bitter Creek was a collection of slapdash buildings clinging to the valley floor, populated by miners, trappers, and people running from their pasts. Eleanor walked into the general store, the bell above the door chiming a cheerful note that clashed with the grim faces of the men gathered around the pot-belly stove. Silence fell over the room as she entered. A woman alone in these parts was a rarity. A woman who looked like a fallen Eastern aristocrat was a curiosity. "I need flour, coffee, and 10 pounds of beans," Eleanor told the proprietor, a balding man with flour dust on his apron, "and cartridges for a Spencer carbine, if you have them." She intended to buy the rifle today. The lie about the gun had scared her enough to make it a truth. The storekeep weighed out the beans. "You are the one living up at the old Blackwell place, are you not?" "I am," he whistled low through his teeth. "Brave or foolish? Maybe both. You know who neighbors you up there?" "I have seen no one," Eleanor said, though the image of the stacked wood flashed in her mind. "You would not see him unless he wanted you to." One of the men by the stove spoke up. He was older, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. "We call him the Phantom." Eleanor turned to look at him. "The Phantom?" "A haint," the man said, spitting into a brass cuspidor. "A devil in a man's shape. Lives high up in the crags. Some say he was a soldier once, but the war twisted him into something else. They say he wears a face of leather because he has no face underneath, just raw meat and malice." "He is just a story," the storekeep said dismissively, wrapping her flour in brown paper. "Just a hermit who wants to be left alone. But the old man is right about one thing. Miss Blackwell. He is dangerous. 2 winters back, a trapper went poking around the high ridges, found him dead in the spring with his neck snapped." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty store. "Was it him?" she asked. "No one can prove it," the storekeep said. "But people round here know better than to trespass past the tree line. You stay close to your cabin, miss, and lock your door." Eleanor rode the rented mule back up the mountain with the weight of their words heavy in her saddlebags. She had fled the judgment of Philadelphia society, only to land in the shadow of a monster. But as the days turned into weeks, the monster proved to be a strange one. The winter arrived in earnest in November. The sky turned a flat, heavy gray, and the snow began to fall not in flakes, but in sheets. Eleanor found herself trapped. The trail down to Bitter Creek was impassable, buried under 4 feet of drift. She rationed her food. She counted her beans. She paced the small cabin like a caged animal, fighting the creeping dread of isolation. The silence was the worst part. It was so absolute it made her ears ring. She found herself talking to the fire, to the rusted kettle, to the empty chair opposite her. Then, the food began to appear. It happened after a particularly brutal storm that shook the cabin to its foundations. Eleanor woke to a world of blinding white. When she forced the door open to shovel a path, she nearly tripped over the bundle. It was wrapped in a roughly cured deer hide. Inside, She found strips of smoked jerky, dark and rich, and a handful of dried huckleberries. There was no note, no footprints. The wind had scrubbed the snow clean. She stood in the doorway, clutching the venison, and scanned the tree line. The forest was a wall of white and black trunks. "Who are you?" she whispered into the wind. Fear warred with gratitude in her belly. The stories from town whispered of a killer, a faceless ghoul. But the killer did not bring food to a starving woman. A killer did not stack wood. She ate the jerky that night, savoring the salt and smoke. It tasted of life. 2 days later, Eleanor decided she could not rely solely on the charity of a ghost. The rabbit snares she had set near the creek were empty, and her stomach was a hollow, aching pit. She needed fresh meat. She bundled herself in every layer she owned. Her wool coat, a shawl, her father's heavy riding gloves she had saved from the auction, and strapped on the snowshoes she had found in the cabin's loft. They were clumsy, oversized tennis rackets of ash and rawhide, but they kept her atop the deep drifts. She ventured further than she usually dared, heading toward a ridge where she had seen hare tracks. The air was crisp, biting at her lungs. The sun dazzled off the snow, blinding in its intensity. She found a game trail and knelt to set a wire noose, her fingers stiff and clumsy in the cold. It was then she saw it, a flash of movement in the peripheral vision of her left eye, a shadow detaching itself from a pine tree. She spun around, gasping, losing her balance. The snowshoes tangled. She fell hard, tumbling down a short, steep embankment hidden by a drift. She grabbed at a branch to stop her slide, but the wood snapped. She landed in a ravine, her right leg punching through the crust of snow and slamming against a jagged, hidden rock. The sound was a wet thud, followed by a snap that she felt in her teeth. Eleanor screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and primal, shattering the stillness of the forest. She tried to pull her leg free, but the pain was blinding, a white-hot spike driving up her thigh. She gasped, black spots dancing in her vision. She looked down. The snow around her knee was turning pink, then red. A sharp branch, buried under the powder, had gouged a deep furrow into her calf, tearing through wool and flesh alike. "Help!" she croaked, but the word was swallowed by the vastness of the woods. She was a mile from the cabin. The sun was already dipping low, the temperature plummeting. Panic, cold and sharp as the wind, seized her. She tried to crawl, dragging the injured leg, but every inch was agony. She managed 3 feet before the darkness at the edges of her vision surged forward to claim her. She lay in the snow, the cold seeping into her marrow, replacing the pain with a deadly, seductive numbness. She thought of her father. She thought of the piano in the parlor. She thought of how quiet it was to die. Consciousness returned not with light, but with warmth. Eleanor floated in a haze, aware of a rhythmic thrumming sound and the smell of wood smoke and sage. She felt weightless, suspended in something soft. She forced her eyes open. The ceiling above her was familiar, the water-stained logs of her uncle's cabin. Firelight danced on the wood, casting long, flickering shadows. She tried to sit up, but a firm hand pressed against her shoulder. "Lie still." The voice was deep, rough like gravel grinding together, unused to speech. It was a voice that sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned her head. A figure sat in the chair by the hearth. He was massive, filling the small space with an overwhelming presence. He wore a coat made of thick bear fur, the pelt dark and shaggy, but it was his face that stole the breath from her lungs. He wore a mask. It was made of stiff, boiled leather, dyed a dark brown. It covered the entire left side of his face and crossed over his nose, leaving only his right eye and the right corner of his mouth visible. The leather was carved with strange, swirling patterns, like the grain of wood. "You," she whispered. "The phantom." The man did not answer. He rose, moving with a silent, predatory grace that belied his size. He approached the bed, and Eleanor shrank back against the wall, pulling the quilt up to her neck. He stopped a foot away. His visible eye was dark, intelligent, and guarded. He pointed a gloved finger at her leg. "Stitched. Do not move it." Eleanor looked down. Her heavy skirts had been cut away up to the knee. Her leg was elevated on a rolled-up blanket. A clean white bandage, tightly bound, wrapped around her calf. Through the cloth, she could see the faint staining of blood, but the throbbing pain had dulled to a manageable ache. You brought me back?" she asked, her mind reeling. She remembered the snow, the cold, the impossibility of the distance. He must have carried her. A full mile through waist-deep drifts. "Found you in the ravine," he grunted. Foolish place to walk. Unstable ground. He turned back to the fire, picking up a tin cup from the hearth. He returned and held it out to her. "Drink. Willow bark and broth." "For the fever." Eleanor hesitated, looking at the leather-clad hand holding the cup. The stories of the murderer, the monster of the crags, screamed in her mind. But the heat radiating from the cup was real. The bandage on her leg was real. The fire crackling in her hearth, piled high with wood she had not chopped, was real. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his leather glove. He flinched, pulling his hand back slightly as if her touch burned him. But he did not drop the cup. "Thank you," she said softly. He did not acknowledge the gratitude. He simply watched her take a sip, his single eye unblinking, intense and unfathomable. "Why?" she asked, lowering the cup. "Why help me? They say you kill trespassers." The man stiffened. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw a flash of something profound and painful in that dark eye. A deep, ancient weariness. "You are not a trespasser," he said, his voice low and rumbling. "You are just lost." He turned and walked toward the door. "Wait," Eleanor called out, panic rising again. "You cannot leave. The storm. My leg. I will bring wood," he said, his hand on the latch. "I will check the bandage tomorrow." "But who are you?" she demanded, emboldened by the fear of being alone again. "What is your name?" He paused. The door cracked open, letting a swirl of snow dance into the room. The wind howled outside, a counterpoint to the silence inside. "Silas," he said, the name sounding foreign on his tongue, as if he had not used it in a lifetime. Then he stepped out into the night, closing the door firmly behind him, leaving Eleanor alone with the fire, the pain in her leg, and the shattering realization that the monster was a man, and he had just saved her life. The days that followed the accident were a blur of fever dreams and the sharp, rhythmic throb of healing flesh. Eleanor spent the first week confined to the narrow bed, her world reduced to the 4 log walls and the square of gray sky visible through the single window. She was not alone, yet she was entirely solitary. The man who called himself Silas did not stay. He was a ghost that haunted the periphery of her consciousness. When she slept, fitful and sweating from the willow bark tea, he would come. She would wake in the pale light of dawn to find the fire stoked, the water bucket filled, and a fresh pot of broth sitting near the coals, still steaming. But the chair by the hearth was always empty. By the second week, the fever broke. The pain in her legs settled into a dull, manageable ache, and the strength began to return to her limbs. With the return of her vitality came a restless, gnawing curiosity. She was alive because of a monster. The town of Bitter Creek spoke of the phantom as a creature of nightmare, a haint that snapped necks and drank blood. But the broth tasted of sage and wild onion, and the bandage on her leg was wrapped with the precision of a surgeon. She needed to see him. She needed to prove to herself that he was real and not a hallucination conjured by pain and freezing temperatures. Eleanor devised a plan. It was foolish, perhaps dangerous, but she was a Blackwell, and stubbornness was her birthright. On a Tuesday evening, when the wind had died down to a low moan, she dragged the heavy rocking chair onto the front porch. She wrapped herself in 2 thick quilts, covering everything but her eyes, and settled into the chair. She set her grandfather's pocket watch on her lap. Though she could not read it in the dark, she forced her breathing to slow, her body to go limp. She feigned the deep, heavy sleep of the invalid. The cold was biting. It nipped at her nose and seeped through the layers of wool. But she did not move. She waited. An hour passed. Then 2. The moon rose, a sliver of bone in a vast, dark ocean of sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. Then she heard it, the crunch of snow. Not the scamper of a fox or the heavy tread of a bear, but the measured, two-legged gait of a man. She kept her eyes slitted, watching through the fringe of her eyelashes. He emerged from the tree line like a shadow detaching itself from the night. He was carrying a massive log on one shoulder, a trunk of pine that would have taken 2 ordinary men to lift. He moved with a silence that was unnerving for a man of his size. He wore the fur cloak she remembered, shaggy and wild, making him look more bear than human. He approached the porch, stepping onto the bottom slat. The wood groaned under his weight. He froze. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. She willed it to be quiet. Silas lowered the log onto her woodpile with a gentleness that belied his strength. Then, he turned toward her. He stood only 5 feet away. The moonlight caught the mask. It was stark and terrifying in the pale light, the leather rigid and unmoving, carved with grooves that mimicked a scowling visage. But the eye, the one human eye revealed by the mask, was wide. He leaned in, just slightly. Studying her, he checked the rise and fall of her chest. He looked at the blanket tucked around her injured leg. For a moment, Eleanor felt a strange sensation. It was not fear. It was the distinct feeling of being cared for, watched over by a guardian who believed himself unseen. She could not hold the ruse. Her breath hitched. His head snapped back. He knew. Before she could throw off the quilt, he spun around, his coat swirling like smoke. "Wait," she cried, struggling to sit up, the quilts tangling around her arms. "Please, wait." He did not stop. He vaulted over the porch railing, landing in the deep snow with a heavy thud, and sprinted toward the trees, running. Then she shouted into the darkness, her voice cracking with frustration. "You cannot hide forever. Silas, I know your name." The only answer was the wind rattling the pines. Despite his flight, he did not abandon her. If anything, his presence became more tangible, though he remained elusive. The woodpile grew higher. Fresh game appeared on her doorstep. Skinned rabbits, a brace of grouse, once a quarter of a young elk. Eleanor began to anticipate his arrival. She would sit by the window as the sun went down, watching the tree line. The fear that had once gripped her, the terror of the unknown, had transmuted into a complex knot of fascination and gratitude. She was a woman who had been discarded by civilized society, cast aside by a fiancé who claimed to love her. Yet here, in the savage wilderness, a man labeled a monster ensured she did not starve. She decided to confront him again, but this time without trickery. A week after the failed trap, she caught him near the creek. She had fashioned a crutch from a sturdy branch and was hobbling down to break the ice for water. He was there, kneeling by the bank, clearing a jam of drift logs that blocked the flow. "Silas," she said firmly. He stood up slowly, water dripping from his gloved hands. He did not run this time. He simply stood there, a towering monolith against the white backdrop, staring at her with that singular, unreadable eye. "Why do you not speak to me?" she asked, leaning on her crutch. "You saved my life. You feed me. Yet you run from me as if I am the one with the weapon." He remained silent. The mask revealed nothing. The leather absorbed the sunlight, dead and dull. "I am not afraid of you," she lied. Her hands were trembling, but she held her ground. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively stiffened. He stopped immediately. He raised a hand, pointing a thick finger at her leg, then at the cabin up the slope. "I can walk," she said, interpreting the gesture. "It hurts, but it is healing. Thank you." He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them until it felt like a physical thing. Then he gave a single, stiff nod. It was a small movement, but it felt like a victory. He turned back to the creek, finished clearing the jam with a violent shove of a log, and walked away downstream, disappearing around the bend. He had acknowledged her. From that day on, the dynamic shifted. He began to linger. When he brought wood in the evenings, he did not vanish the moment she opened the door. He would stand by the chopping block, axe in hand, watching as she collected the logs. She began to talk to him. It started as a necessity, telling him she had enough meat or that the roof was leaking. But soon it spilled over into a one-sided conversation that filled the lonely void of her life. She told him about Philadelphia. She told him about the way the cobblestones sounded under carriage wheels in the rain. She told him about her father's library, the smell of old paper and tobacco, and how she used to hide there to read adventure novels. She told him about Julian, and how easily he had walked away when the money was gone. Silas never spoke, but he listened. She could tell by the way he held his head, cocked slightly to the side, his eye following her movements as she worked on the porch. One evening, as the twilight turned the snow to lavender, Eleanor sat on the steps, shelling dried beans into a bowl. Silas was splitting kindling 10 yards away. "It is strange," she said, her voice soft. "I spent my whole life surrounded by people, ballrooms, dinner parties, crowded streets. Yet I never felt seen. I was just an ornament, a Blackwell daughter." The rhythmic thwack of the axe stopped. "Here," she continued, looking out at the vast empty valley. "There is no one, just the wind and the wolves. And you. And for the first time, I feel real." Silas rested the axe head in the snow. He looked at her, and slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. She frowned. "Do you disagree?" He pointed at the cabin, then at her, and then made a sweeping gesture toward the horizon, toward the east. He shook his head again. "You think I do not belong here?" she said. He nodded. "You are wrong," she said, a flash of defiance heating her chest. "I have nowhere else. This is my home now." He stared at her, his gaze intense. Then, he reached into the deep pocket of his coat and pulled out something small. He walked over to the porch. Eleanor held her breath. He placed the object on the railing. It was a small carving made of pine, a bird, a chickadee, delicate and perfectly formed. Its wings spread in mid-flight. The detail was exquisite, every feather etched with care. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the rough wood. "It is beautiful," she whispered. She looked up to thank him, but he was already retreating to the safety of the trees. The communication grew. A nod for yes, a shake of the head for no, a shrug for indifference. It was crude, primitive, but it was a language they built together. One night, under a sky clear and bright with stars. Eleanor brought out 2 tin cups of coffee. Silas was sitting on a stump near the fire pit she had cleared, whittling. He hesitated when she approached, his muscles tensing as if to flee. "Please," she said. It is just coffee. It is bitter. I am afraid I ran out of sugar weeks ago." He did not run. He slowly reached out his hand. Eleanor extended the cup. As he took it, his fingers brushed against hers. He was wearing his gloves, coarse, stained leather, but the sensation jolted through her like a spark from the hearth. It was a solid, heavy contact. She felt the heat of his hand through the layers of leather and wool. He froze. Eleanor did not pull away. For a heartbeat, they were connected, the steam from the coffee rising between them, the silence heavy with unsaid words. She looked at his mask. Up close, she could see the wear on the leather, the places where it was rubbed smooth. She wondered what lay beneath it. She wondered if the man who carved delicate birds could truly be the monster the town feared. "Thank you." "Silas," she breathed. He jerked his hand back, taking the cup with him. He turned away sharply, his shoulders hunched, and drank the scalding coffee in one long gulp. Then he set the cup down in the snow and walked into the darkness without a backward glance. Eleanor stood alone on the porch, clutching her own cup, her hand still tingling from the brief, phantom touch. The loneliness that night was different. It was not the hollow ache of isolation. It was the sharp, burning sting of yearning. By mid-December, Eleanor's leg was strong enough to bear weight. The larder was running low on flour and coffee, and she knew she had to brave the journey to Bitter Creek before the deep winter truly set in. Silas disappeared when he saw her saddling the mule. He watched from the ridge, a dark sentinel, but he did not approach. He did not approve of her leaving the safety of the mountain. She sensed that, but he would not stop her. The ride down was grueling. The trail was slick with ice, and the wind bit through her coat. When she finally arrived in Bitter Creek, she felt like a stranger returning from another world. The noise of the town, the shouting of men, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the barking of dogs felt aggressive and overwhelming. She tied the mule at the general store and went inside. The warmth of the stove hit her like a physical blow. The store was empty save for the proprietor and an older woman sweeping the floor. The woman had gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face etched with the lines of a hard life. She looked up as Eleanor entered, her eyes narrowing. "You are the girl from the Blackwell cabin," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am Eleanor Blackwell." "Yes, still alive." The woman grunted, leaning on her broom. "There was a betting pool at the saloon. Most men had you dead by the first frost. I am made of sterner stuff than they think," Eleanor said, moving to the counter. The woman studied her. "Or you have had help?" Eleanor froze. She kept her face neutral. "I have managed," the woman chuckled. A dry, rasping sound. "You can lie to the men, girl. They are half blind anyway, but I see the way you are looking at the cartridges. I see you are eating fresh meat, not just beans." "You have seen him." Eleanor turned to face her. "Who?" The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Silas Cade." Eleanor felt the name settle in the air, heavy and significant. "Do you know him?" "I knew him," the woman corrected. "Before the war? Before he became the Phantom?" "Tell me," Eleanor said. The demand came out sharper than she intended. The woman sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "His name is Silas. He was a good man once, a blacksmith, like his father. Strong as an ox, gentle as a lamb. Then the war came. He rode out with the Union cavalry. Gone 4 years. What happened to him?" Eleanor asked. The woman's expression darkened. "The devil only knows the whole truth." But stories came back. Bad stories. "He was a captain toward the end. They say he was ordered to burn a town in Georgia. Women, children, trapped in a church. They say he tried to stop it. Or maybe he started it. The reports were confusing. But there was an explosion. A powder magazine went up. Killed his whole platoon. And Silas? He survived." The woman traced a line down her own face. "But not whole. He came back here 5 years ago, sneaking in at night. I saw him once, without that mask he wears now." She shuddered, a genuine ripple of revulsion passing through her frame. "It is not a face a man can live with," she whispered. "Burned, melted. The eye, God, the eye. He ran to the mountains. He thinks he is a beast, so he acts like one. They say his mind is as broken as his face, that the guilt ate what the fire left behind." Eleanor felt a wave of nausea, but it was not from disgust. It was from a profound, aching sorrow. She thought of the delicate wooden bird. She thought of the soup left by her door. "He is not a beast," Eleanor said quietly. The woman looked at her with pity. "Be careful, girl. A wounded dog bites the hand that feeds it. Silas Cade is dead. There is only the Phantom now." Eleanor rode back up the mountain in a daze. The wind howled around her, but she hardly felt it. The image of the man, the soldier, the blacksmith, the survivor, overlaid the image of the monster in the mask. He wore the leather not to hide his face from the world, she realized, but to hide the world from his shame. He was punishing himself. Every moment of silence, every cold night alone, was a penance for the sins of the war. When she reached the cabin, it was dark. She unpacked her supplies with trembling hands. She built up the fire, her mind racing. Fear was still there. Yes, the woman's warning about his broken mind lingered. But beneath the fear was something else, a gravitational pull. She wanted to see him. She wanted to tell him that she knew, and that it did not matter. But the mountain had other plans. 2 days after her return, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the air pressure dropped so low her ears popped. The blizzard hit with the fury of a biblical plague. The wind screamed like a banshee, shaking the cabin logs. Snow slammed against the windows, piling up inches by the hour. It was a whiteout, a blinding curtain of ice that erased the world. Eleanor huddled by the fire, wrapping herself in every blanket she owned. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted. She could see her breath in the air. She heard a thumping at the door. Heavy, urgent. She rushed to it, unlatching the bar. The wind tore the door from her grip, slamming it against the wall. Silas stood there. He was covered in snow, his fur cloak white with it. He was carrying an armful of logs, but he was swaying. The cold was too much even for him. "Come in," Eleanor screamed over the wind. He hesitated. He looked at the warm glow of the fire, then back at the dark, deadly storm. He looked at her, standing small and frail in the doorway. "Silas, come inside. You will die out there." He stepped over the threshold. Eleanor slammed the door shut and threw the bolt, leaning against the wood to catch her breath. The silence of the cabin returned, though the storm raged outside. She turned to look at him. He seemed too big for the room. He filled the space, a wild element brought indoors. He stood by the door, dripping melting snow onto the floorboards, looking uncomfortable. Trapped, he clutched the firewood to his chest as if it were a shield. "Put the wood down." "Silas," she said gently. "Come to the fire." He moved stiffly, stacking the wood by the hearth. Then he stood back, keeping to the shadows, as far from her as he could get while still feeling the heat. Eleanor moved to the pot hanging over the fire. "I made potato soup," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "With the salt pork I bought in town. There is enough for two." She ladled soup into 2 bowls. She walked over to the table and set one down. She sat at the opposite end, leaving the chair nearest the fire for him. "Please," she said, "sit." Silas looked at the chair. He looked at the soup. Slowly, he unbuttoned his heavy fur cloak and let it slide from his shoulders. Underneath, he wore a faded mended union tunic, stripped of its buttons and rank, stretching tight across his broad chest. He sat. The chair creaked. They ate in silence. The only sound, the clinking of spoons and the howling wind. It was an intimate, domestic scene that felt completely at odds with the reality of who they were. A disgraced heiress and a disfigured recluse. When he finished, he pushed the bowl away. He rested his hands on the table. They were bare. He had taken his gloves off to eat. Eleanor stared at his hands. They were large, capable hands. The knuckles were scarred, the skin rough and calloused from years of labor. But they were human hands. Without thinking, acting on the instinct that had been growing in her for weeks, Eleanor reached across the table. Silas watched her hand coming. He did not move. He seemed frozen, mesmerized. She laid her hand over his. Her skin was pale and soft against his weathered flesh. Silas flinched, a full-body shudder that rattled the table. He looked at their joined hands as if he were seeing a miracle, or a horror. "Silas," she whispered. He looked up at her. The single eye was wide, unguarded. In the firelight, she saw the moisture gathering in the corner of it. His hand trembled beneath hers. It was a violent tremor, the shaking of a man holding back a scream. He turned his hand over, slowly, agonizingly, until his palm met hers. His fingers curled around her hand, engulfing it. His grip was rough, desperate, hanging onto her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He did not speak. He did not take off the mask. But in the grip of his hand, Eleanor felt the crushing weight of his loneliness and the terrifying heat of a heart that had started to beat again. She did not pull away. She let him hold her, while the storm buried the world outside, leaving them alone in the fragile sanctuary of the firelight. The blizzard raged for 3 days, sealing the cabin in a tomb of white. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the howling wind, the groaning of the timber walls, and the circle of firelight that held Eleanor Blackwell and the man called Silas Cade. For the first 2 days, the silence between them was a physical weight, heavier than the snow piling against the door. Silas was a constant, brooding presence. He moved with a stiff, Careful economy, tending the fire, melting snow for water, and eating the meager meals she prepared with his back half turned to her. He slept on the floor in the far corner, wrapped in his bare fur, a dark mound that barely seemed to breathe. Eleanor watched him. She felt the vibration of his presence in every nerve ending. The fear she had once harbored had evaporated, replaced by a desperate, clawing need for connection. She had lived in silence for months. She had been abandoned by her family, by her fiancé, by society. And now, this man, this broken, terrified giant, was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. On the third night, the storm began to break. The screaming wind died down to a mournful whistle. The silence inside the cabin deepened, becoming suffocating. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, watching Silas whittle a piece of firewood with a long, wicked knife. The shavings curled onto the floorboards. "Speak to me," she whispered. The knife paused, then resumed its rhythm. "Scrape, scrape, please," she said, her voice cracking. "You saved my life. You carried me through the snow. You fed me when I was starving. But you act as if you are not here. As if I am not here." Silas did not look up. The mask remained fixed on the fire. "I am going mad with the quiet." "Silas, tell me something, anything. Tell me to stop talking. Tell me to leave. Just use your voice." He stopped whittling. He stabbed the knife into the log with a sudden violence that made Eleanor jump. He sat there, his shoulders heaving beneath the rough wool of his tunic, his head bowed. When he finally spoke, the sound was like a rock slide in a canyon, deep, grating, and painful. It was the voice of a man whose throat had forgotten the shape of words. Eleanor. It was just her name, 2 syllables. But the way he said it, broken, gravelly, imbued with a reverence she had never heard from any suitor in Philadelphia, shattered her. Eleanor let out a sob. It was not a sound of sadness, but of relief so profound it buckled her knees. She slid from the bed to the floor, weeping into her hands. She cried for the cold, for the loneliness, for the father she had lost, and for the sheer, overwhelming intimacy of hearing her name spoken in the dark by this stranger. Silas moved. He crossed the room, his boots heavy on the wood. He hesitated, then knelt awkwardly beside her. He did not touch her. He simply existed near her, a wall of heat and leather. "Do not cry," he rasped. His voice was a rusty hinge forcing itself open. "Please." Eleanor wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Looking up at him, the mask was inches away. The visible eye was filled with panic. "I thought you hated me." She sniffed. "No," he rumbled, the word vibrating in his chest. "No, then why? Why the mask? Why the silence?" He pulled back, sitting on his heels. He looked at his hands, the scarred knuckles clenching and unclenching. "Because," he said, each word a struggle, "I am not fit. Fit for what? For this, for light, for you." He stood up abruptly and paced to the window, staring out at the blackness. "I was a captain," he said. The words came faster now, tumbling out like water from a breached dam. "The 3rd Cavalry. We rode under Sheridan. We were supposed to be heroes." He leaned his forehead against the cold glass. "Georgia, 1864. We were ordered to clear a valley, rebel supplies, but it was just a village. Farmers, old men, women." Eleanor held her breath, sensing the poison he was trying to draw out. "There was a church," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled her more than the wind. "They hid inside. The orders were to burn the structures, to leave nothing for the enemy. My sergeant." He threw the torch before I could check inside. He turned to face her. The firelight cast the carved grimace of his mask into sharp relief, making it look demonic. But his body posture was that of a child expecting a blow. I heard them screaming. "Eleanor." I heard the choir singing. And then I heard them screaming. I ran in. I tried to drag them out. The smoke, it was so thick. He touched the leather covering his cheek. There was powder stored in the vestry. A trap. Or maybe just bad luck. It blew the wall out. It took my men. It took the villagers. And it took my face. He sank onto the chair by the hearth, burying his head in his hands. I woke up in a field hospital 3 days later. They told me I was a hero. They gave me a medal, but I smell the smoke every night. I see their faces in the fire. I am not a man. Eleanor, I am the thing that burns. I am the beast that brings the ash. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the wreckage of his confession. Eleanor stood up. Her leg throbbed, but she walked steadily across the room. She stopped in front of him. You think you are the only one with sins? Silas. He looked up, confused. My father was Tobias Blackwell. She said, a pillar of the community, a deacon. He stole the pensions of 300 families to pay for our carriage horses and my silk dresses. He ruined them. When the truth came out, he put a pistol in his mouth and left me to answer for it. She stepped closer, her skirts brushing his boots. I was engaged to a man named Julian. I thought he loved me. I thought I was precious to him. The day the news broke, he sent a messenger to retrieve my ring. He did not even look me in the eye. I was not a person to him. I was an asset that had lost its value. She knelt before him, placing her hands on his knees. The leather of his breeches was rough under her palms. I walked through that town, Silas, and people spat on my hem, the same people who had eaten at my table. I came here because I believed I was poisoned. I believed I deserved to be alone in the cold because I was the daughter of a thief. Silas stared at her, his single eye searching her face. You did nothing, he rumbled. You were innocent, and you tried to save them. She countered fiercely and low. You ran into the fire. That is not what a monster does. That is what a man does. A man who breaks. She reached out and took his hand, the one that had trembled earlier. We are both broken. Silas, we are both hiding, but I am tired of hiding alone. He did not pull away. He sat still, breathing raggedly, as if her touch was the only thing keeping him from flying apart. The storm broke the next morning. The sun rose on a world sculpted from blinding diamond dust. The drifts were 5 feet high against the cabin walls. They did not speak of the night's confessions, but the air between them had changed. The tension remained. But it was no longer the tension of fear. It was the tension of a bowstring pulled taut, humming with potential energy. They worked. It was a necessity of survival, but it became a domestic ritual. Silas shoveled the path to the woodpile, his breath plumbing in the frigid air like a steam engine. Eleanor cooked, stretching their meager supplies into hearty stews. She mended the tears in his tunic while he sharpened her axe. He did not leave. The concept of him returning to his cold, solitary cave or wherever he laid his head seemed to have evaporated. He slept in the corner of the cabin, and Eleanor slept in the bed, and the space between them felt charged with electricity. In the evenings, after the work was done, they sat by the fire. The silence was now companionable. Though heavy with unspoken things, Eleanor would read from the one book she had brought, a battered volume of poetry, and Silas would listen, his head tilted, drinking in the words. She watched him when he thought she was not looking. She watched the way his large hands handled the fragile wood of his carvings. She watched the way his back muscles moved beneath his shirt when he lifted the heavy iron kettle. She saw the man beneath the scars, the strength that had survived the fire, and she felt the want growing in her. It started as a warmth in her chest and spread outward, a slow, sweet ache that made her skin sensitive to the air. She wanted to touch him, not just his hand, but the broad expanse of his shoulders, the rough line of his jaw. She wanted to know the texture of him. 10 days after the storm, the moment broke. It was late. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the room in deep, ruddy shadow. Eleanor was sitting on the rug, repairing the hem of her skirt. Silas was oiling his boots. Eleanor looked up. The light caught the curve of his masked cheek, the rigid, unnatural leather, but it also caught the fullness of his mouth, the human part of him that was exposed. "Silas," she said softly. He looked up, alert. "Yes?" She put down her needle. She rose to her knees and moved toward him. He went still, his hand freezing on the boot leather. She stopped directly in front of him. She could smell him, wood smoke, pine resin, and the musk of a man who worked hard in the cold. It was an intoxicating scent. She reached out, slowly, deliberately. She pulled the glove from her right hand. She dropped it onto the floor. Then she reached for his left hand, the one resting on his knee. She tugged at the fingers of his heavy leather gauntlet. He resisted for a second, his muscles locking. Then, with a shuddering exhale, he surrendered. She slid the glove off, revealing a hand that was scarred on the back but possessed a palm that was callous and warm. She took his bare hand and raised it. He was trembling, a fine vibration that traveled through her own bones. She guided his palm to her cheek. His skin was rough, abrasive against her softness, but the heat of it was shocking. Silas flinched as if he had burned her. He tried to pull back. "I will hurt you," he whispered. "My hands, they are too rough." "No," she said, pressing her face into his palm. "You could never hurt me." He let out a sound that was half groan, half sob. His fingers curled, tentatively at first. Then, with growing confidence, cupping her jaw, he traced the line of her cheekbone with his thumb. The touch was reverent, as if he were handling a holy relic that might crumble at any moment. "You are so soft," he murmured, wondering in his voice. "Like silk. I had forgotten." Eleanor turned her face, kissing the center of his palm. He gasped. "Silas," she whispered against his skin. "Take it off." He froze. The hand on her face became rigid. He pulled back, the connection severed. "No, please, I want to see you." "You cannot," he said, his voice rising in panic. "You do not know what it looks like. The children in the town, they screamed. I cannot see that look in your eyes. Eleanor, I cannot bear it. If you see me, you will hate me." "I could never hate you." "You will be disgusted. It is meat. Eleanor, it is twisted and wrong." "I do not care about the scars," she said, her voice fierce. "I care about the man who stayed. I care about the man who fed me. I care about the man who is trembling because he is afraid to be loved." She moved closer, until her knees were between his. She reached up, her hands hovering near the leather straps behind his head. He grabbed her wrists. His grip was hard. Panicked. "Do not, please." Eleanor looked into his single eye. It was wide with terror, a raw vulnerability that broke her heart. She saw that he truly believed he was a monster. He believed it so deeply, it was woven into his soul. "All right," she whispered. "All right." She lowered her hands, but she did not pull away. "If I cannot see you," she said, "then feel me." She leaned forward. She closed her eyes and pressed her lips to the leather cheek of the mask. It was cold and tasted of tannin and oil. She lingered there, breathing him in, letting him feel the acceptance in the gesture. Then she moved her head. She found his mouth. It was a hesitant kiss. Her lips brushed against his, soft and questioning. For a heartbeat. Silas did not move. He sat like a statue, his breath suspended. Then, something in him snapped. He made a guttural noise deep in his throat. His hands released her wrists and wrapped around her waist, pulling her into him with a desperate, starving hunger. His mouth crushed against hers. It was not gentle. It was the kiss of a drowning man finding air. It was rough, clumsy, and overwhelmingly passionate. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to his shoulders, gripping the wool of his tunic. She opened to him, meeting his desperation with her own. He tasted coffee and desire. The scruff of his beard grazed her chin. The hard edge of the mask pressed into her cheekbone, but she did not care. He kissed her as if he wanted to devour her, as if he were trying to absorb her light into his darkness. One of his hands tangled in her hair, pulling her head back to deepen the angle. The other pressed into the small of her back, arching her against his hard chest. Suddenly, he tore himself away. He scrambled back, his chest heaving, pushing her gently but firmly to arm's length. He turned his head away, the mask hiding his expression, but his visible ear was burning red. "I am sorry," he gasped. "I am sorry. I should not have. I am a beast. I do not know how to be gentle." Eleanor's lips were swollen and tingling. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at him, this powerful, terrified man who was trying to protect her from himself. She reached out and grabbed the lapels of his tunic. She yanked him back toward her with a strength that surprised them both. "You are not who I thought," she whispered fiercely. He looked at her, stunned. "I thought you were a ghost," she said. "I thought you were dead on the mountain. But you are just a man. Silas, you are a man who is warm and alive, and you want me just as much as I want you. I will break you," he groaned. But his resistance was crumbling. "Then break me," she challenged. She reached for the buttons of her dress. Her fingers were steady. She undid the top button, then the second. Silas watched, his eyes darkening, the pupil blowing wide. His breathing became ragged. "Eleanor," he warned, but the word lacked all conviction. She shrugged the dress off her shoulders, letting it pool at her waist. She wore a simple cotton chemise underneath. The firelight turned her skin to gold. She reached out and touched the buttons of his tunic. "May I?" she asked. He did not answer. He simply stopped breathing. She undid the buttons, one by one. She pushed the heavy wool aside. The shirt beneath was threadbare. She pulled it up. His chest was a map of violence. There were scars there, too. Burn marks that mottled his ribs, old bullet wounds. But there was also muscle, hard and defined. She leaned in and pressed a kiss to the jagged scar over his heart. Silas shuddered, a low moan vibrating in his chest. He reached for her then. The hesitation was still there, a tremor in his hands, but the hunger was stronger. He pulled her up, lifting her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her to the bed. He laid her down on the quilts. He stood over her for a moment, a dark silhouette against the fire, the mask still in place. A guardian gargoyle turned lover. Then he shed his clothes. He moved with a frantic haste now. When he joined her in the narrow bed, the heat of his body was overwhelming. He hovered over her, bracing his weight on his elbows, terrified of crushing her. Eleanor reached up and wrapped her arms around his neck. She pulled him down, the leather mask pressed against her face, cold and hard, a barrier between them. But the rest of him was bare and burning. His skin against hers was a revelation, rough texture meeting smooth, hard muscle meeting soft curves. He moved slowly at first, every touch a question. Is this allowed? Is this real? His hands explored her body with a reverence that made her weep silently. He touched her hip, her waist, her breast, treating her not like the fallen woman the town saw, but like something sacred. But Eleanor did not want reverence. She wanted him. She arched into him, her nails digging into his shoulders. "Silas," she breathed. The sound of his name on her lips undid him. The dam broke completely. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, groaning, and moved against her with the rhythm of the earth itself. There was no shame in the dark. There was only the firelight flickering on the walls, the sound of their breath mingling, and the desperate, life-affirming collision of two souls who had been left for dead by the world. Silas Cade, the phantom of the Bitterroots, made love to her with an intensity that bordered on worship, and Eleanor Blackwell, the disgraced daughter of the East, held him fast, kissing the leather of his mask, whispering promises into the dark, claiming the monster as her own. The next morning, the sun was blinding. Eleanor woke alone in the bed, but the space next to her was still warm. She sat up, pulling the quilt around her naked shoulders. She felt sore, a pleasant, heavy ache in her limbs. Silas was standing by the window. He was fully dressed, his fur cloak back on his shoulders. He was looking out at the snow. "Silas?" she called softly. He turned. The mask was still there, but his posture had changed. The hunch in his shoulders was gone. He stood taller. He walked over to the bed. He did not retreat to the corner. He sat on the edge of the mattress. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His hand was ungloved. "I have to check the traps," he said. His voice was still rough, but the jagged edge of panic was gone. Eleanor leaned into his touch. "Will you come back?" He looked at her, his single eye soft. I have nowhere else to go. Eleanor, you are the only warm thing in this world. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a chaste, domestic gesture that felt more intimate than anything that had happened the night before. Then he stood and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. He did not look back, but he spoke one last time. Thank you. For what? She asked. For seeing me, he said. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the blinding white, leaving Eleanor with the fire, the memory of his wait, and the certainty that the thaw had finally begun. The weeks that followed were a golden time, suspended in the amber of winter. The world outside remained hostile, locked in ice, but inside the cabin, a new life took root. They fell into a rhythm of intimacy. Silas no longer slept in the corner. He slept beside her, his massive frame curling around her, spooning her against the cold. He still wore the mask during the day, and he still refused to take it off when the candles were lit, but in the absolute pitch black of the deep night, sometimes, just sometimes, she felt the cold leather gone. She felt scarred, uneven skin against her shoulder, but she never said a word. She let him have his secrets. Knowing that trust was a slow-growing plant, she kissed his scars in the dark. She ran her hands over the ridges of burn tissue on his back and arms, mapping the history of his pain. He began to believe, slowly, hesitantly, that he could be touched without burning the person who touched him. But the world does not leave people alone forever. It was late January when the peace was shattered. Eleanor was outside, hanging washed linens on a line she had strung between two pines. The air was crisp, the sky a hard, brilliant blue. Silas was chopping wood around the side of the cabin. She heard the horses before she saw them. The sound of hooves crunching through the snow crust echoed up the valley. Eleanor froze, a wet shirt in her hand. Visitors never came this high in winter. 3 riders emerged from the tree line. They were heavily bundled, their horses blowing steam. The lead rider was a man Eleanor knew. Thomas Miller. He had been a suitor in Philadelphia, a man of moderate wealth and small imagination who had come west to speculate on land. He had courted her before the scandal, and he had been one of the first to turn his back when her father fell. He pulled his horse up short, staring at her. He took in her rough woolen dress, her chapped hands, the men's boots she wore. Eleanor, he said, disbelief coloring his voice. Eleanor Blackwell. Thomas, she said, her voice cold. What are you doing here? I heard you were alive, he said, swinging down from his saddle. He walked toward her, arrogance in his stride. People in town said a crazy woman was living in the old Blackwell ruin. I did not believe it. I'm not crazy. Thomas, and this is my land. He looked around, sneering at the cabin. A hovel. You are living like a savage. Eleanor, this is beneath you, even for a Blackwell. What do you want? He smiled, a slick, practiced expression. I've come to help you. Of course, I heard about your inheritance. This land. It has timber rights, water rights. It is worth something. I am willing to take it off your hands. I will give you a ticket back east and enough money to settle somewhere. Quiet. I am not selling, she said firmly. Come now, he said, stepping closer. Look at you. You are thin. You are worn out. This is no place for a woman alone. I am not alone. The words hung in the air. Thomas stopped. He frowned. What? I said I am not alone, she repeated, lifting her chin. Thomas laughed. A harsh, barking sound. Who? The ghost? The phantom? Do not tell me you have taken up with a drifter. Eleanor. He reached out and grabbed her arm. You are coming with me. I will not leave a white woman up here to be used by some mountain trash. Unhand me, she snapped, struggling against his grip. Just then, a shadow fell over them. Thomas looked up. His eyes widened. The 2 men on horses behind him gasped, reaching for their rifles. Silas stood at the corner of the cabin. He held his axe in one hand. He was wearing the mask, and in the bright sunlight, it looked more terrifying than ever. He looked like a demon summoned from the earth. Let her go, Silas growled. The sound was low, dangerous, trembling with suppressed violence. Thomas released Eleanor as if she were hot iron. He stumbled back, his face draining of color. "What in God's name is that?" Thomas stammered. Silas took a step forward. The snow crunched loudly. "Leave," Silas said. "Now!" Thomas scrambled back to his horse, mounting with clumsy haste. He looked from Silas to Eleanor, his fear turning to disgust. "So it is true." He spat. "You are whoring for the monster!" Silas roared. It was the sound of pure animal rage. He raised the axe. Thomas kicked his horse, and the beast reared, turning and bolting down the trail. The other two men followed, their faces pale with terror. Silas watched them go, his chest heaving. He stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the wind. Then he turned to Eleanor. He did not speak. He looked at her, then at the retreating tracks, and then, with a sound of utter despair, he dropped the axe. He turned and ran. He did not run toward the cabin. He ran toward the deep woods, toward the crags, disappearing into the trees like a wounded animal seeking a place to die. "Silas!" Eleanor screamed, but he was gone. She waited for him. She waited all night. She kept the fire high. She paced the floor, but he did not come. By the second day, fear began to gnaw at her sanity. Not fear of the cold or of Thomas returning, but fear for Silas. He looked broken. The look in his eye when Thomas called her a whore. It was the look of a man whose worst nightmares had been confirmed. She packed a satchel with dried meat and a flask of water. She strapped on her snowshoes. She tracked him. It was not hard. His footprints were deep and erratic, plowing through the snow without care for stealth. They led up toward the high, jagged peaks where the wind stripped the trees bare. She found him miles away, in a small cave sheltered by a granite overhang. He was curled on the ground, shivering violently. He had no fire. He had lost his fur cloak somewhere along the way. He was freezing to death. "Silas!" She scrambled into the cave, dropping to her knees beside him. He was conscious, but his eyes were glazed. He looked at her without recognition at first. "Go away," he mumbled, his teeth chattering. "Go away. I will hurt you. I dirty everything I touch." "No!" she cried, pulling him into her arms. She unbuttoned her own heavy coat and wrapped it around both of them. "You are freezing. Let me die. Eleanor, he was right. I am a monster. I made you. Lo!" She grabbed his face, the leather mask and the cold flesh alike. She forced him to look at her. "Listen to me, Silas Cade. You did not make me low. You raised me up. You saved me. That man, Thomas, he is the monster. He is small, cruel, and empty. You have more honor in your little finger than he has in his entire body." She rocked him, rubbing his back to generate heat. "I love you," she sobbed. "Do you hear me? I love you. Mask or no mask. Scars or no scars. I love you." Silas went still. The shivering stopped for a moment. "You love me?" he whispered. "I do. I swear it." He let out a long, shuddering breath. He buried his face in her shoulder, clinging to her. Then, slowly, his hands came up. He reached behind his head. His fingers fumbled with the buckles. "Silas?" He sat back. He looked at her, his single eye clear now, filled with a terrifying resolve. "If you love me," he rasped, "then you must know." He undid the bottom strap. Then the top, the leather mask, came loose. He held it for a second, a shield he had hidden behind for 10 years. Then he lowered it. Eleanor did not look away. The left side of his face was a ruin. The skin was melted, shiny and taut, varying in color from white to angry red. The ear was gone, just a hole in the side of his head. The left eye was sealed shut, the eyelid fused by the fire. His lip was pulled up in a permanent snare, revealing teeth and gum. It was brutal. It was hard to look at. It was the face of war, but it was his face. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She did not feel revulsion. She felt a fierce, protective ache. She saw the pain he had carried every day for a decade. She reached out. Her hand did not tremble. She touched the ruined cheek. The skin was smooth, unlike the rough leather. Silas closed his good eye, waiting for the scream, waiting for her to run. Eleanor leaned forward. She kissed the sealed eyelid. She kissed the melted cheek. She kissed the snarling lip. "You are mine," she whispered against his skin. "You are mine." "Silas." He opened his eyes. He looked at her with wonder, with disbelief, and finally, with peace. He pulled her down into the dirt of the cave floor, wrapping her in his arms. "We go home," he said, his voice stronger than she had ever heard it. "We go home, and in the cold, dark cave, with the wind howling outside, the phantom died, and the man began to live." The weeks that followed the incident in the high cave were a quiet revolution. The Bitterroot winter still held the mountain in its iron teeth. The snow piled high against the eaves of the cabin, but inside, the air had shifted. It was no longer the stale, silent air of two ghosts haunting the same space. It was the warm, living breath of a home. Silas Cade had returned from the brink of death, but he had not returned unchanged. The frostbite on his fingers had healed, leaving the skin tender and pink, but the ice in his soul had cracked. He slept in the bed now. It was a slow, tentative migration. The first night back from the cave, he had slumped on the floor in his furs, exhausted. But Eleanor had simply held open the heavy quilt, her eyes defying him to refuse. He had climbed in, stiff with a lifetime of solitude, and lay on the very edge of the mattress, his back to her, rigid as a plank. But sleep is a thief of defenses. In the deep, blue hours of the night, Eleanor would wake to find the massive weight of him shifted toward her. She would find his arm, heavy and solid, draped over her waist, anchoring him to the earth. She would turn in the dark, the fire down to embers, and press her face against the rough wool of his tunic. She learned the map of his breathing, the hitch when he dreamed of fire, the long, shuddering exhales when he settled into peace. He still wore the mask during the day. The moment the sun grayed the window, he would rise, turn his back, and secure the leather shield. It was a reflex, a compulsion he could not yet break. But in the dark, when the candles were snuffed, he allowed it to slip. One night, a week after their return, Eleanor reached out in the pitch blackness. Her fingers found his face. Not the smooth, cold leather, but the heat of skin. She traced the ridge of the scar tissue on his left cheek, the sealed eyelid, the twisted lip. He flinched, his breath catching in a sharp hiss. "Hush," she whispered, her thumb stroking the ruined flesh. "It is just me." She felt his heart hammering against her chest. He was waiting for the revulsion, for the recoil. Instead, she leaned in and pressed her lips to the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "You are warm," she murmured against his skin. "You are so warm." Silas let out a sound that was half groan, half prayer. His hand came up, gripping her shoulder, not to push her away, but to hold her there, in the safety of the dark, where he could not see the pity or horror he feared in her eyes. He let himself be loved. He let himself believe, if only until dawn, that he was not a monster, but a man who had simply survived the fire. But the world below the tree line was not content to let them be. The confrontation with Thomas Miller had not gone unnoticed. Though Thomas had fled in terror, his fear had quickly curdled into indignation and gossip in the warmth of the Bitter Creek saloons. The story of the Mad Blackwell woman and her beast spread like rot in a grain sack. Eleanor saw the signs first. She found boot tracks near the creek that were not Silas's. She saw the glint of a spyglass from the ridge across the valley. The solitude of the mountain was being eroded. Silas sensed it too. He became sharper, more jagged. He spent hours cleaning his rifle, the repetitive snick-snick of the cloth and oil filling the cabin. He stopped whittling the delicate birds. He paced. "We need supplies," Eleanor announced one morning in late February. The flour barrel was scraping bottom, and the coffee was long gone. "I will go," Silas said, his voice tight. "No," Eleanor countered, tying her bonnet strings with determined fingers. "You know what will happen if you ride into town. Thomas has poisoned them against you. They will see a threat. I will go. They will see a woman buying beans." Silas stood by the door, his single eye dark with worry. He looked at her, then at the rifle leaning against the wall. "I will not let you go alone. I will be fine. Silas, I will be close," he said, the tone brokering no argument. "I will keep to the trees, but I will be close." The journey down was tense. Eleanor rode the mule, her back straight, ignoring the sensation of eyes watching her from the timber. She knew Silas was there, a shadow moving parallel to the trail, a ghost guarding its treasure. But she never saw him. Bitter Creek was slushed with mud and melting snow. The town felt hostile. As Eleanor tied the mule to the hitching post outside the general store, conversation on the boardwalk died. Men stopped chewing their tobacco. Eyes followed her, hard, assessing, lacking the deference she had once commanded as a lady of society. She walked into the store, the bell chiming a false cheer. The proprietor, Mr. Henderson, did not smile. "Miss Blackwell," he said, wiping the counter with a rag that looked grayer than the sky. "We heard you were occupied up there. I am surviving. Mr. Henderson, I need 50 pounds of flour, 10 of sugar, and coffee." He weighed the goods in silence. Eleanor could feel the weight of the stares from the men gathered around the stove. Among them was a trapper she recognized, a man named Frenchie, known for his foul temper and his cruelty to his dogs. "So it is true then," Frenchie called out, his voice loud and slurring with whiskey. "The high and mighty princess is shacking up with the freak." Eleanor stiffened. She placed her money on the counter, gold coins she had saved from her father's cufflinks. "I am purchasing goods, sir. My private life is not for sale." Frenchie laughed, standing up. He was a big man, smelling of unwashed pelts and stale beer. "Private life? There is nothing private about betting a monster, girl. Tell me, does he keep the mask on when he mounts you, or does he let you kiss the raw meat?" The room went dead silent. "Mr. Henderson stopped weighing the sugar. Eleanor turned slowly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning. "You are a vulgar, small man," she said, her voice cutting through the smoky air like a razor. "And you are not fit to speak his name." She turned back to the counter. "Just the flour. Mr. Henderson, I will not spend another minute here." She grabbed the sack of flour, hauling it onto her shoulder with a strength that surprised them, and marched out. Frenchie followed her. She reached the mule and began to tie the sack to the saddle. Frenchie grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "Do not walk away from me, you little whore," he snarled. "I reckon you need a real man to show you what—" The sentence was never finished. There was a blur of motion from the alleyway beside the store. A dark shape launched itself into the street with the force of a falling boulder. Frenchie was torn away from Eleanor and slammed into the mud. Silas was on top of him before the trapper could draw a breath. Silas was not wearing the fur cloak. He was in his tunic and breeches, the mask stark and terrifying in the gray daylight. He did not look human. He looked like a judgment incarnate. He grabbed Frenchie by the throat with one hand and lifted his head, slamming it back into the semi-frozen muck. "Silas!" Eleanor screamed. Silas did not hear her. The rage that had been festering in him, the shame of the past decade, the fear of losing Eleanor, the memory of every insult, exploded. He punched the trapper. It was a sickening sound, bone meeting cartilage. Frenchie's nose shattered. Silas raised his fist again. He was going to kill him. Eleanor saw it in the set of his shoulders, the absolute mechanical violence of the motion. He was back in Georgia. He was back in the fire. "Silas, no!" Eleanor threw herself at him, grabbing his raised arm. He was immovable, a statue of iron. "Look at me," she cried, digging her fingers into his sleeve. "Silas, you are not a killer. Do not let them make you this." Silas froze. His fist hovered inches from the unconscious, bloodied face of the trapper. He was breathing in ragged, tearing gasps. He looked up. A crowd had gathered. The sheriff was running from the jailhouse, a shotgun in his hands. The townspeople were staring, not with hatred, but with pure, unadulterated horror. They were looking at a beast. Silas looked at Eleanor. He saw the fear in her eyes, not fear of him, but fear for him. He realized what he had done. He had proven them right. He dropped Frenchie's limp body. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping in the mud. He looked at his hands, stained with the trapper's blood. "Monster," he whispered. He turned and ran. He did not take a horse. He ran on foot, sprinting toward the tree line with a speed born of self-loathing, disappearing into the dense timber before the sheriff could even raise his weapon. Eleanor did not wait for the sheriff's questions. She mounted the mule, leaving the flower in the mud, and kicked the animal into a gallop. She did not go back to the cabin. She followed the tracks. Silas had not gone to the cave this time. He had gone deep into the wildest part of the forest, into a thicket of black spruce where the light barely touched the ground. She found him 3 miles up, near a small, frozen waterfall. He was kneeling by the water, scrubbing his hands with snow. The water around him was pink. He was scrubbing so hard the skin of his knuckles was raw and bleeding, but he wouldn't stop. "Silas," she said, her voice breathless. He did not look up. "Do not come near me." She slid off the mule and walked toward him. The snow was deep here, soaking her skirts. "Silas, stop! Your hands are clean." "They are never clean," he roared. Spinning around, he was shaking violently, his whole body vibrating. He ripped the mask off his face and threw it into the snow. "Look at me," he screamed. "Look at what I am. I nearly beat a man to death. Eleanor, I enjoyed it. For a moment, I wanted to crush his skull. That is not a man. That is a rabid dog." He fell to his knees, burying his ruined face in his hands. "I tried," he sobbed, the sound tearing out of his throat. "I tried to be gentle. I tried to be what you wanted. But the war is still in me. It is in my blood. I cannot live in your world. I will only destroy you." Eleanor walked to him. She knelt in the snow, heedless of the cold seeping into her bones. She reached out and took his freezing, wet hands in hers. She pulled them away from his face. He tried to pull away, turning his head to hide the scars, the milky eye, the snarling lip. "Stop hiding," she commanded softly. She held his hands tight. "You are not a dog, Silas. You are a man who defended the woman he loves. Was it violent? Yes, this is a violent world. That man put his hands on me. You protected me." He shook his head, tears leaking from his good eye and tracking through the burns on his left cheek. "I lost control. I wanted to kill him. Because you have been hurting for 10 years, she said. Because you have swallowed every insult and every stone thrown at you. You are human. Silas, humans break." She released his hands and reached up, cupping his face. She did not flinch. She did not hesitate. Her thumbs traced the line of the burn. "You think this face makes you a monster?" she asked. "It makes me scared." "No, it makes you a survivor." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "The war broke many men. Silas, it broke my father in a different way. It broke Julian. It broke the men in that town who stand by and watch cruelty happen. But you carried me through the snow. You fed me. You held me when I was sick. That is the man I know." She pulled back slightly, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I do not want a perfect man. Silas, I do not want a man with a smooth face and a hollow heart. I want you. I want the man who carves birds. I want the man who trembles when I touch him." "I am afraid," he whispered. "I know," she said. "So am I. But we will be afraid together." She stood up and pulled him to his feet. He rose slowly, unsteady, like a colossus that had lost its foundation. "Pick up your mask," she said gently. "Not to hide, but because we have a cold ride home." He looked at the leather lying in the snow. He picked it up, brushing off the ice. He looked at it for a long moment. Then at her. He did not put it on. He shoved it into his pocket. "I am done hiding from you," he said. The ride back to the cabin was silent, but the air had changed. The frantic energy of the violence had dissipated, replaced by a profound, exhausting clarity. They arrived at the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of violet and rose. The air was biting cold. They went inside. Silas barred the door. He moved to the hearth and built the fire up until it roared, chasing the chill from the room. He turned to face her. He was still unmasked, in the bright, fluctuating light of the fire. His face was fully exposed. There were no shadows to soften the damage. The scar tissue shone tight and waxy. The missing ear, the damaged eye, it was all there. A map of agony. He stood by the fireplace, his arms hanging at his sides, waiting. He was letting her see him, really see him. Not in a cave, not in the dark, but in their home, in the light. Eleanor took off her coat and hung it on the peg. She turned to him. She walked across the room, her eyes never leaving his face. She stopped in front of him. She reached out and touched his left cheek. "You are mine," she whispered. Silas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since 1864. His good eyes closed. He leaned his face into her palm. "Eleanor." He breathed. She kissed him. She did not kiss his lips first. She kissed the scar on his temple. She kissed the sealed eyelid. She kissed the hollow where his ear had been. She kissed the tight, pulled skin of his cheek. She kissed every inch of the ruin, reclaiming it, sanctifying it. Silas stood trembling, tears running freely now, washing over the scars. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. "You are not who I thought," she murmured, echoing the words she had said weeks ago. "You are so much more." She pulled back and began to undo the buttons of his tunic. He helped her this time. There was no hesitation. They undressed each other by the light of the fire, clothes falling like shed skins. When they lay on the bed, the room was warm with golden light. Silas hovered over her, and for the first time, he did not dim the lantern. He did not turn his face away. He looked at her with his single piercing eye, and with the damaged one that could no longer see but was part of him nonetheless. "You are beautiful," he rasped. "And so are you," she answered, and she meant it. She saw the strength in the set of his jaw, the vulnerability in his mouth, the history written on his skin. They made love with a slow, deliberate tenderness. It was not the frantic, desperate collision of the cave. It was an acknowledgement, a conversation of bodies. Silas moved with a new confidence. He was no longer hiding. He watched her face as he touched her, drinking in her pleasure, letting it wash away the memory of the smoke and the screams. Eleanor held him, her hands moving over the scars on his back, his shoulders, his face. She anchored him in the present. She pulled him down to her, kissing him deeply, tasting the salt of his tears and the sweetness of his surrender. In the candlelight, fully exposed, stripped of all armor, Silas Cade finally came home. He buried his face in her hair, whispering her name over and over, like a benediction. And outside, the wind howled through the bitter roots, but it could not touch them. They were a fortress of two. The morning brought a steel-gray sky and a heaviness in the air that promised more snow. Silas was up before Eleanor. She woke to the smell of coffee, the last of the grounds she had found in the back of the cupboard. She sat up. Silas was sitting at the table, polishing his rifle. The mask was sitting on the table next to him. He was barefaced. He looked up when she stirred. He did not look away. He offered a tentative, lopsided smile, limited by the scarring, but genuine. "In the morning," he rumbled. "Morning." He put the rag down. "We have a problem," he said, his voice serious. Eleanor wrapped the quilt around herself and joined him at the table. "The sheriff," she said. Silas nodded. "I assaulted a man in broad daylight. I broke the peace. And Thomas Miller, he will use this. He will say I am dangerous. He will say you are in danger." "He is right about one thing," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You are dangerous. To men like him." Silas squeezed her fingers. "They will come for me, Eleanor. Not just one or two. A posse. The law. Let them come," she said, a fierce light entering her eyes. "This is my land, and you are my—" She paused. "Your what?" he asked softly. "My heart," she said simply. Silas brought her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles. "Then we prepare," he said. "We board the windows. We check the ammunition. If they want to take me, they will have to climb the mountain to do it. And if they want to take this land," Eleanor added, looking at the deed that still sat on the mantel. They will have to go through a Blackwell. They sat together in the gray light, the coffee cooling between them, the mask lying forgotten on the wood. The quiet peace of the winter was over. The siege was about to begin. The silence that held the mountain was not the peace of solitude. It was the held breath of a predator before the strike. For 2 days, Eleanor Blackwell and Silas Cade had lived in the shadow of the inevitable. They had fortified the cabin as best they could, barring the door with heavy oak and stacking firewood beneath the windows. But they both knew that wood and stone were poor defenses against the malice of men. It began with the barking of a dog, a sharp, staccato warning that echoed up the valley floor. Then came the thud of hooves, not the tentative steps of a few riders, but the thunder of many. Silas stood by the window, the shutters cracked just enough to allow the barrel of his Spencer carbine to protrude. He was not wearing the mask. He had made a promise to her, and he intended to keep it, even if it meant the last thing these men saw was the face they feared. "How many?" Eleanor asked, standing behind him, her hand gripping the back of his tunic. 12, Silas said, his voice flat. "Maybe 15. Miller has brought a posse." Eleanor moved to the other window. Down in the clearing, a line of riders fanned out. They were a motley collection, rough men from the mines, bored drunks from the saloon, and at the center, sitting tall on a chestnut mare, Thomas Miller. He wore a heavy wool coat with a fur collar that looked too pristine for the wilderness, a stark contrast to the grim, weathered faces of the men flanking him. "Come out," Miller shouted, his voice amplified by the cupped hands around his mouth. "We know you are in there. Cade, we have a warrant for your arrest." Silas did not move. "What is the charge?" he roared back. "Assault," Miller replied smoothly. "And kidnapping," Eleanor gasped. "Kidnapping." She shoved past Silas and threw open the heavy door, stepping out onto the porch before Silas could stop her. The cold wind whipped her skirts around her legs. She stood tall, her chin lifted, looking every inch the defiance of a woman who had survived the winter. "There is no kidnapping here." "Thomas!" she yelled, her voice ringing clear across the snow. "I am here by my own choice. Leave this land. You are trespassing." Miller's expression shifted from feigned concern to a sneer. He spurred his horse forward a few paces. "Eleanor, you are distraught," he called out, his tone patronizingly sweet. "You have been up here alone with that animal for months. Stockholm Syndrome is a powerful thing. We are here to rescue you. I do not need rescuing. That is for the law to decide," Miller said. He gestured to the man beside him. "Sheriff Brady, a man with a weak chin and eyes that wouldn't meet Eleanor's. Sheriff, take the prisoner." Silas stepped out onto the porch, placing himself in front of Eleanor. The sight of him, the raw, red scar tissue, the missing ear, the milky eyes shining in the harsh sunlight, caused the horses to whine and shy. Several men cursed and raised their rifles. "Step aside, Miss Blackwell," the sheriff called out, his voice wavering. "We are taking him in." "Over my dead body," Eleanor said, grabbing Silas's arm. "That can be arranged," Miller muttered. He raised his voice. "We are not leaving without him. Eleanor, if you force us, we will burn you out." He signaled to a man on the far left, who lit a torch wrapped in oil-soaked rags. The flame flared orange against the snow. "We will torch the cabin," Miller yelled. "With both of you inside if need be. I'd hate to see you perish in the fire, Eleanor, but if you protect a criminal, you share his fate." Silas went rigid. He looked at the torch, the flame dancing in the wind. Eleanor felt the tremor run through him, not of fear, but of memory. The smoke, the screams, the church in Georgia. "No," Silas whispered. "Not fire." He looked at Eleanor. His good eye was filled with a terrible, crushing love. "I cannot let you burn," he said softly. "Silas, do not," Eleanor began, clutching his sleeve. He gently peeled her fingers away. "I surrender," Silas bellowed, his voice cracking like thunder. He tossed the carbine into the snow. He raised his hands, the palms open and empty. "Do not burn the cabin. he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "She needs shelter." "Silas!" Eleanor screamed, grabbing at him, but he stepped off the porch, walking steadily toward the line of guns. "Take him," Miller ordered. 3 men dismounted. They rushed Silas, slamming him into the snow. They were rough, eager to hurt the monster that had terrified their town. They bound his hands behind his back with rawhide strips, pulling them tight enough to cut the skin. One of them kicked him in the ribs. Silas grunted but made no sound of pain. "Stop it!" Eleanor cried, running down the steps. She tried to reach him, but Miller cut his horse in front of her, blocking her path. "It is for your own good, my dear," Miller said, looking down at her with cold, dead eyes. "You will thank me when your mind clears." They hauled Silas up and threw him over the back of a spare horse, tying his ankles beneath the animal's belly as if he were a carcass. He did not look back at her. He hung his head, his hair falling over his ruined face. Eleanor stood in the snow, watching them ride away, the laughter of the men carrying on the wind. She was alone again, but this time, the silence was not empty. It was filled with a rage so hot it could have melted the snow beneath her boots. The town of Bitter Creek was in a festive mood. The phantom had been caught. The monster was in a cage. By the time Eleanor arrived, riding her mule to the point of exhaustion, the sun had set. The windows of the Golden Nugget Saloon were glowing yellow, and the sound of a piano clashed with the raucous laughter of men celebrating their victory over a lone, scarred man. She went straight to the jailhouse. It was a small, brick building at the end of the street. Sheriff Brady was sitting at his desk, feet up, whittling a stick. "I want to see him," Eleanor demanded, slamming the door behind her. The sheriff jumped, dropping his knife. "Now, Miss Blackwell, you know I can't do that. Judge Holloway is coming in from Helena in 2 days. Until then, the prisoner is incommunicado. He is not a prisoner. He is a man you kidnapped. He assaulted Frenchie," the sheriff said, his eyes shifting away. "And he's been squatting on your land. Miller says he's been threatening you. Miller is a liar." The sheriff shrugged. "Tell it to the judge. Now go on. Miss Blackwell, go to the hotel. Get some rest. You look like you've been through hell." Eleanor turned and walked out. She did not go to the hotel. She went to the livery stable, paid the boy a nickel to watch her mule, and then she walked the darkened streets. She needed leverage. She needed proof. Silas had told her once, during the long winter nights, about the arrangement with her uncle. "Tobias didn't abandon the place," Silas had said. "He left it to me to watch until his kin came. There was a paper." She had searched the cabin and found nothing, but as she walked past the sheriff's window, she saw a pile of Silas's belongings on the desk, his belt, his knife, and a small, battered leather pouch he wore around his neck. The sheriff blew out the lamp and left. Locking the door, Eleanor waited until his footsteps faded. Then she went to the back of the jail. The cell window was high and barred, but she dragged a crate over and climbed up. "Silas?" she whispered into the gloom. There was a rustling of straw. A shadow moved. Silas's face appeared in the moonlight, filtering through the bars. He looked haggard, his eyes swollen shut from a fresh beating. "Eleanor," he rasped. "Go! It is not safe! I am getting you out!" she said fiercely. "The paper. Silas. The letter from my uncle. Where is it?" "In the pouch," he said. "The sheriff took it. I saw it on the desk." "Eleanor, leave it. Miller owns this town. He owns the sheriff. They will not let me go. They will have to," she said. She jumped down. She did not have the strength to break into the jail. She needed a key, or she needed a distraction. She walked toward the hotel where Thomas Miller was staying. The lights were on in the second-floor suite, the best room in town. She could see his silhouette pacing. She pulled her coat tighter and walked into the lobby. The clerk was asleep. She crept up the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached Miller's door. She could hear voices inside. Easy enough to hang him. A man was saying, "Frenchie will testify he was attacked unprovoked." And the girl? That was Miller's voice. "She's broken." Miller laughed. "Without the beast, she has no one." I'll have the deed signed over by the end of the week. The timber rights alone are worth $50,000. And once she's destitute, she'll come crawling back. She always was soft. Eleanor pressed her ear to the wood. And the other matter? The unknown man asked. The business back east? Buried, Miller said. The sound of glass clinking followed. Her father was a fool. He never knew I was the one who tipped the auditors. He thought I was his friend until the moment he pulled the trigger. It was easy to shift the ledger numbers to his accounts. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and dizzy. It wasn't just the land, it was everything. Her father's death, her ruin. It had all been Thomas Miller. He had destroyed her family to strip her of her inheritance and her pride, waiting to swoop in as the savior. She backed away from the door, her hands trembling. She didn't just need to free Silas. She needs to destroy Thomas Miller. The trial was a farce held in the saloon. As the courthouse was under repair, the room was packed with spectators, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Judge Holloway, a tired-looking man with a whiskey nose, sat at a table on the small stage. Silas sat in a chair to the left, his hands chained. He looked small despite his size, defeated. He kept his head down, hiding his face. Thomas Miller stood in the center of the room, playing to the crowd. "This man is a menace," Miller shouted, gesturing to Silas. "A squatter who preyed on a defenseless woman, a violent brute who nearly killed a local trapper." The crowd murmured in agreement. "We demand justice," Miller cried. "We demand he be removed from this community permanently." "Hang him," someone shouted from the back. Judge Holloway banged his gavel. "Order." "Does the prisoner have anything to say?" Silas did not look up. He shook his head. "Then I am prepared to pass a sentence." The judge said, "I have something to say." The doors of the saloon swung open with a crash. Eleanor Blackwell stood there. She had washed her face and brushed her hair. She wore her travel-stained dress, but she wore it like a suit of armor. In her hand, she held a heavy iron pry bar she had stolen from the blacksmith, and she held a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. "Miss Blackwell," Miller said, his smile straining. "This is not the place." She marched down the center aisle, the crowd parting before her. She ignored Miller. She walked straight to the judge. "This man is innocent," she announced, her voice steady and carrying to the rafters. "Eleanor, please," Miller said, stepping toward her. "You are hysterical." She swung the pry bar up, pointing it at his chest. "Back away. Thomas, or I will finish what Silas started." The room gasped. Miller froze. She turned to the judge. "I broke into the jailhouse this morning. Your Honor, I retrieved this from the prisoner's personal effects." She slammed the paper onto the table. "It is a letter from my uncle, Tobias Blackwell, dated 1869. She began to read, not from the paper, but from memory, having read it a dozen times in the dawn light. "To whom it may concern, I, Tobias Blackwell, being of sound mind, do entrust the care of my property on Bitterroot Ridge to Silas Cade. He has saved my life more than once. He is to live on the land as he sees fit, and protect it until such time as my niece, Eleanor, comes to claim it. He is no squatter. He is the guardian of this mountain." She looked at the crowd. "He was protecting me from the winter, and from men like him." She pointed the bar at Miller. "That is a forgery," Miller shouted, though sweat was breaking out on his forehead. "And is this a forgery?" Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, black ledger. She had found it in Miller's saddlebags while the town was at the trial. "This is Thomas Miller's private account book," she declared. Miller lunged for her. "Give me that." Silas moved. He didn't stand up. He simply kicked his chair backward, tripping Miller mid-stride. Miller sprawled onto the floor. Eleanor opened the book. "It details payments to the auditor who condemned my father," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "It details the transfer of funds from my father's company to a private account in Boston held by Mr. Miller, and it details the bribes paid to the men in this room to look the other way while he harassed me." She looked at the sheriff. $50 to Sheriff Brady to ignore the harassment reports. The sheriff sank low in his chair. She looked at the crowd. Thomas Miller stole my father's life. He stole my inheritance. And now he wants to hang an innocent man so he can steal my land. The mood in the room shifted instantly. It was a physical thing, a wave of hostility turning like a tide. In the West, you could kill a man in a fair fight, but you did not steal a man's money with a pen, and you certainly did not frame a woman's father. Miller scrambled to his feet, looking around. He saw the dark looks of the miners. He saw the trappers fingering their knives. "She's lying," he screamed. "She's crazy. She's sleeping with the beast. That beast," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a hush that silenced the room, "is twice the man you will ever be." She walked over to Silas. She didn't have a key. She took the pry bar and jammed it into the chain links of his handcuffs. She levered it with all her weight. The cheap iron of the jailhouse chains groaned, then snapped with a sharp crack. Silas stood up. He rubbed his wrists. He looked at Miller. "Run," Silas rumbled. Miller did not need to be told twice. He bolted for the door, the jeers of the crowd following him. He would not stop running until he reached the railhead, and he would never set foot in Montana again. Judge Holloway looked at the letter, then at the ledger. Case dismissed. He grunted, banging the gavel. "Sheriff, you're fired." They walked out of the saloon into the blinding afternoon sun. The townspeople watched them go, but no one spoke. There was no apology in their eyes, only a wary respect. Eleanor Blackwell and the Phantom were not people to be trifled with. They collected the mule and Silas's horse, which had been tied behind the jail. They rode out of town without looking back. The journey up the mountain was slow. The adrenaline that had sustained Eleanor was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. But her heart was light. They were free. The truth was out. But the mountain had one final cruelty in store. As they crested the last ridge, the smell hit them. Acrid, wet ash. Silas kicked his horse into a gallop. Eleanor followed, dread pooling in her stomach. They burst into the clearing. The cabin was gone. It was a smoldering ruin of blackened logs and collapsed timbers. The stone chimney stood alone, a tombstone marking the grave of their home. Miller's men had made good on their threat before riding down to the trial. Silas slid from his horse. He walked toward the wreckage, his boots sinking into the soot. He stood there, staring at the remains of the bed where they had loved, the hearth where they had eaten, the walls that had sheltered them. "It is gone," he whispered. "Everything." Eleanor dismounted. She walked to him and took his hand. "Not everything," she said. He looked at her, his face streaked with soot and tears. "We have the land," she said. "We have the deed, and we have the truth. But the winter," Silas said, looking at the sky. "The snow is coming. Eleanor, we have no roof, no food. They burned the larder." "We will build," she said. "Build what? A palace of ash?" "A shelter," she said firmly. She led him away from the ruin, into the deep woods where the pines grew thick and close. "We are not going back to town," she said, "and we are not leaving." They worked with the desperation of the damned. The sun went down, and the temperature plummeted, but they did not stop. Silas used his knife to cut heavy boughs of spruce and fir. Eleanor dragged them through the snow, her hands numb. They found a depression in the earth, sheltered by the roots of a massive fallen cedar. They leaned thick branches against the trunk, weaving the boughs through them to create a thick, insulated wall. They piled snow over the outside for insulation. It was a debris hut, a bear den, a primitive, ugly, beautiful thing. They gathered what dry wood they could find and built a small fire at the mouth of the shelter. They had no blankets. Those had burned. They had no food. They had only the clothes on their backs and the heat of their bodies. They crawled inside. The space was small, forcing them to lie tangled together. Silas wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. He opened his heavy coat and pulled it around her as well, creating a cocoon of wool and fur. "I am sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I brought this on you." "You brought me life," she answered, shivering. She turned in his arms, finding his face in the dark. She kissed his scars. tasting the ash of their home. We will survive this. Silas, we survived the war. We survived the loneliness. We will survive the cold. Silas tightened his grip. He buried his face in her neck. I know, he said, and as the first flakes of the new storm began to fall, burying the ashes of the past, they fell asleep, holding onto each other. Two warm sparks in the heart of the frozen wilderness. The blackened scar of the cabin was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow within a week. The mountain did not mourn the loss of the structure. It simply swallowed the ash and moved on. But for Eleanor Blackwell and Silas Cade, the loss was a physical amputation. They lived like wolves in the den they had constructed beneath the roots of the fallen cedar. It was a cramped, dark space, smelling of pine resin, damp earth, and the musk of their unwashed bodies. They had lined the floor with boughs of spruce, layer upon layer, to keep the freezing ground from sucking the life out of them. But the cold was a living thing. It found the gaps in the weaving. It settled in their lungs. November bled into December, and December turned into the iron-gray depths of January. The game, which had been plentiful in the autumn, vanished. The deer moved to the lower valleys to escape the deep drifts, and the rabbits stayed underground. Silas spent hours each day tracking, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his breath trailing behind him like a ghostly banner. He often returned with nothing but frostbite on his cheeks and a hollow look in his eyes. They ate meagerly. A squirrel, a handful of pine nuts, tea made from needles to stave off the scurvy. They were always hungry. It was a dull, constant ache that sharpened into a blade whenever the wind howled. Eleanor tried to be strong. She tried to match Silas's stoicism. She kept the small fire at the mouth of the shelter fed, rationing the dry wood they had scavenged. She melted snow in the 1 tin pot Silas had managed to save from the ruins of the cabin, boiling it with strips of dried bark to create a bitter, watery broth. But she was not made of the same raw timber as Silas. Her body, softened by a life of eastern parlors and carriages, had been hardened by the mountain. Yes, but it had its breaking point. The stress of the trial, the burning of her home, and the relentless, gnawing cold finally found a crack in her armor. It started with a cough, just a dry tickle in her throat. Then came the shivers, violent and uncontrollable, that no amount of furs could quell. By the 3rd day of her illness, Eleanor could not stand. Her skin burned to the touch, dry and papery, while her teeth chattered so hard Silas feared they would shatter. Silas was terrified. He had faced cannon fire. He had walked into a burning church. He had lived alone with his demons for 10 years. But seeing Eleanor fade, watching the light in her eyes dim as the fever took hold, paralyzed him with a fear he had never known. He stopped hunting. He could not leave her side. He became her entire world. He was the hand that lifted her head to sip water. He was the voice that rumbled in the dark, anchoring her to reality. He was the heat that kept her alive. He stripped off his heavy coat and lay beside her in the small, dark space, pulling the furs over them both. He pressed his body against hers, sharing his warmth, willing his strength to flow into her. "Stay with me," he whispered against her hair. "Do not go. Eleanor, I command you, do not go." But Eleanor was drifting. The fever took her to places she had thought she had left behind. She was back in Philadelphia. She was standing in her father's study, but the books were burning. She was walking down the aisle of a church, but everyone in the pews was wearing a leather mask. She saw Julian, her former fiancé, laughing as he threw coins at her feet. In her delirium, the walls of her defenses crumbled. The secrets she had kept locked in the deepest chambers of her heart spilled out. "I am empty," she murmured, thrashing in Silas's arms. "Hush, Eleanor. You are safe." "No," she cried out, her voice thin and reedy. "I am broken. Silas, they took all the pieces. My father, he took the honor. Julian, he took the love. The town, they took the name. There is nothing left. You are everything," Silas said, stroking her damp forehead. "You will see," she rambled, tears leaking from her closed eyes. "When the snow melts, when you look at me, you will see I am just a shell. You will leave, Everyone leaves. I am too heavy to carry. I am too sad to love. Silas tightened his grip. He pulled her closer until her head rested on his chest, right over the steady, thumping rhythm of his heart. I am not going anywhere, he said, his voice fierce and low. He kissed her fever-hot temple. I am the one who is broken. Eleanor, I am the one with the face of a nightmare. But you kissed the scars. You claimed the ruin. Do you think I would leave the only person who ever saw me? She did not hear him. She was lost in the gray fog. Silas worked with a desperate focus. He dug through the snow to find the roots of the echinacea plants he remembered seeing in the summer. He boiled them into a concentrated sludge. He forced it between her lips, drop by drop. He snared a snowshoe hare that had ventured too close to the shelter, skinning it with shaking hands, and made a rich broth, feeding it to her as if it were the elixir of life itself. He did not sleep. He watched her chest rise and fall. Every shallow breath was a victory. Every pause was a terror. For 4 nights, the fever raged. Eleanor tossed and turned, crying out names of the dead, begging for forgiveness for sins she had not committed. And for 4 nights, Silas held her. He whispered to her. He told her stories of the land, of the way the eagle rides the thermal, of the sound the aspen makes in the autumn, of the secret places where the trout hide. He poured his soul into her, trying to fill the emptiness she feared she held. On the morning of the 5th day, the fever broke. Eleanor woke to a silence that felt different. The wind had died down. The air in the shelter was still. She opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was Silas. He was leaning over her, his face gray with exhaustion, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. His beard was unkempt, and his hair hung in greasy strands, but his single good eye was bright with a terrifying hope. "Eleanor?" he croaked. "Silas." Her voice was a whisper, rough as sandpaper. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He collapsed forward, resting his forehead on her shoulder. "You came back," he breathed. "I was lost," she said weakly. "I was in the dark. I know, I held you." She tried to lift her hand. It felt heavy, like lead, but she managed to touch his cheek. The scar tissue was rough under her fingertips. "You stayed," she said. "I will always stay." She remembered the fear then, the things she had said, the naked, ugly truth of her insecurity. I told you I was empty," she whispered, shame coloring her pale cheeks. "And I told you that you are the marrow of my bones," Silas said, lifting his head to look at her. "You are not empty. Eleanor, you are the strongest thing on this mountain. You fought the fever just as you fought the town, and you won." He reached for the tin cup kept warm near the firestones. "Drink," he said gently. He lifted her head, supporting her neck with his large hand. She drank the broth. It tasted of smoke and wild meat, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. Recovery was slow. For weeks, Eleanor was too weak to leave the shelter. She lay on the furs, watching the play of light at the entrance of their den, listening to the dripping of the icicles as the midday sun touched them. Silas was her constant guardian. He nursed her back to health with a tenderness that belied his massive frame. He combed the tangles from her hair with his fingers. He washed her face with warm water. He brought her the best cuts of the meat he hunted. As her strength returned, so did her clarity. They spent long hours talking in the dim light of the shelter. The brush with death had stripped away the last of their pretenses. They spoke of the future. "We cannot stay here," Eleanor said one evening. She was sitting up, wrapped in the bare fur, watching Silas mend a tear in his moccasin. Silas stopped his work. He looked at the low roof of branches above them. "This is your land," he said. "You fought for it. It is land. Silas, dirt and trees. It is not worth dying for. And the cabin is gone. We could rebuild in the spring and wait for Thomas Miller to send another man, or for the town to find a new reason to hate us." She reached out and took his hand. "This place is poisoned. Silas, it is full of ghosts. My uncle's ghost, The ghost of who I was when I arrived. The ghost of the phantom. Silas looked down at her hand. Where would we go? West, she said. Further west, over the pass, to Oregon, or Washington. Somewhere where the trees are different. Somewhere where no one knows the name Blackwell, and no one has ever heard of the phantom of the Bitterroots. A new start, he mused. A clean slate. She corrected. For both of us. We leave the masks here. We leave the shame here. Silas was silent for a long time. He looked at his scarred hand, then at her face, the face that had looked at his ruin and called it beautiful. I have nothing to take, he said, only my rifle. And you. That is enough. She smiled. That is more than enough. The decision was made. They would wait for the thaw. When the pass was clear, they would pack the mule and the horse, and they would walk away from the inheritance that had almost cost them their souls. The weeks passed, and the grip of winter began to loosen. The sun grew warmer. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of wet, brown earth that smelled of waking life. The creek, which had been a silent ribbon of ice, began to roar with meltwater. On the eve of their departure, the weather turned unexpectedly mild. A Chinook wind blew over the mountains, warm and scented with pine. The sky was a vaulted ceiling of crushed velvet, dusted with 1,000,000 stars and dominated by a moon so full and bright it cast shadows on the snow. Let us sleep outside, Eleanor said. One last time. Silas looked at the sky. It is safe. He agreed. They carried their furs out of the cramped shelter and laid them on a flat rock that overlooked the valley. Below them, the darkness of the forest stretched out like a sea. Above them, the universe watched. They lay down, side by side, looking up at the stars. Silas turned to her. The moonlight washed over his face. He was not wearing the mask. He had burned it in the fire 2 nights ago, watching the leather curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. He looked at her with his mismatched eyes, the dark, intense brown of the right, and the clouded, milky white of the left. In the moonlight, the scars were silver rivers on his skin. You are beautiful, Eleanor whispered, tracing the line of his jaw. He caught her hand and kissed the palm. I am a man who loves you, he said. That is all I am. He leaned over her. He kissed her, slow and deep, a kiss that tasted of the coming spring. It was not the desperate, hungry kissing of their first night, nor the fevered, fearful kissing of the sickness. It was the kiss of a husband, steady, enduring, promising. Eleanor wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down. The heavy furs shielded them from the lingering chill of the earth. They moved together with a slow, languid rhythm, their bodies remembering the map of each other. There were no words needed. The silence of the mountain was a cathedral, and their love was the prayer. Silas moved over her, his weight a comfort, his touch reverent. He worshipped her with his hands and his mouth, and she met him with an open heart, taking him into her, holding him as the moon began its slow descent toward the jagged peaks. They fell asleep entangled, limbs heavy and warm, under the vast, indifferent sky that no longer frightened them. The morning of the departure was bright and crisp. The sun turned the melting snow into a field of diamonds. They packed quickly. There was little to take. The few tools they had saved, the remaining furs, the rifle, a small sack of dried meat they had smoked. Eleanor went to the ruins of the cabin one last time. The snow had melted enough to reveal the blackened stones of the hearth. She stood there for a moment, remembering the girl who had arrived in the wagon so many months ago, stiff, proud, and terrified. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who wore buckskin breeches and a man's coat, a woman who knew how to set a snare and how to love a scarred man. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, carved wooden bird, the chickadee Silas had given her. It was the only keepsake she was keeping. Goodbye, she whispered to the ruins. She turned and walked back to where Silas was waiting with the animals. He helped her mount the horse. He would walk, leading the mule. He checked the cinch on her saddle, his hand lingering on her knee. Ready? he asked. She looked down at him. He was standing tall, his face turned toward the sun. He did not look back at the cave, or the shelter, or the burnt cabin. He was looking west. "I am ready," she said. Silas clicked his tongue to the mule. He took the lead rope of Eleanor's horse. They began to move. They walked down the old game trail, leaving the clearing behind. They moved through the forest where they had hunted, past the creek where they had gathered water, past the place where Eleanor had broken her leg and found her life. The snow was slushy under the hooves, but patches of green grass were poking through. The air smelled of wet earth and sap. A hawk circled overhead, screaming its cry. They did not speak as they descended the mountain. There was no need. They were in perfect step, a unit forged in fire and ice. As they reached the ridge that looked out over the vast, rolling plains to the west, Silas stopped. He swept his arm across the horizon, a world of endless possibility, of rivers uncrossed and valleys unnamed. "Somewhere out there," he said, "there is a place for us." Eleanor smiled. She leaned forward, resting her hand on his shoulder. "We are already there." "Silas," she said softly. He looked up at her, confused. "Home is not a cabin," she said. "It is not a valley." She touched his chest, right over his heart. "I am home, and you are mine." Silas covered her hand with his own. He smiled, a true, crooked, beautiful smile that reached his eyes. He turned back to the trail. He did not pull his hat down to hide his face. He walked with his head high, leading his wife toward the horizon. They moved slowly, two small figures against the vastness of the American West, disappearing into the light of the afternoon sun. They left no address. They left no legacy in the town of Bitter Creek other than a burnt foundation and a legend that would be told in hushed tones for a generation. But in the quiet places, where the wind whispers through the pines and the snow falls soft and deep, the mountain remembers them. It remembers the woman who tamed the beast and the man who took off his mask to kiss her. It remembers love. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Eleanor and Silas touched your heart as much as it did mine. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption and love in the wild frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories like this one. And do not forget to share your thoughts on the ending. Did you like that they chose to leave everything behind to start anew? I look forward to reading your comments.